Okay, dive listeners, we've got quite a collection of material here. It gives us this really fascinating snapshot of just one day, May 28th, 2025.
Yeah, it's a mix, isn't it? Articles, some research, your notes,
Hmm.
all focused on the big global headlines from that Wednesday.
Exactly. And our mission basically is to unpack all this, figure out the key developments, what was really shaping things on that specific day.
It's like putting that single 24-hour period under a microscope, isn't it? Looking at what mattered globally.
And wow, the range of topics in this source material is, well, it's broad. We've got U.S. policy shifts, international tensions, tech news, even major environmental events.
It's a lot to cover, definitely. But that's what we're here for, right?
Sure.
To sort through it together in this deep dive.
Right. So where should we start? Maybe U.S. politics and policy. A lot of the material seems focused there.
Sounds good. And yeah, one theme that really jumps out immediately is immigration enforcement under the Trump administration. Seems like there was a significant ramp up on this day.
An escalation, what kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, the material points to a few key things happening almost at once. One big one was pausing new student visa appointments.
Pausing student visas. That sounds like it would have a pretty immediate impact on people wanting to study here.
Oh, absolutely. It essentially closes off that pathway, at least temporarily. And then they also went to the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. What for?
They were asking the court to okay deporting people to third countries. The note specifically mentioned South Sudan as an example.
Deporting people to South Sudan, that's quite specific. And what about ICE tactics? Anything changing there?
Yeah, the information suggests a shift there, too. Things like detaining individuals right at courthouses, which is,
We're at
controversial.
courthouses, wow.
And even, this is quite concerning, targeting high school
These
students.
school students,
Yeah,
really, that definitely makes you stop and think. So these actions, they weren't just out of the blue, right? Part of a bigger picture.
exactly. Fits a pattern described in the material ongoing efforts to restrict immigration. Mentions of pushing for tougher social media checks for visas, trying to increase deportations overall.
Although the material notes they were still below their own targets.
Right, even with these intensified efforts, apparently still falling short of the stated goals.
So the key players here are President Trump, ICE, the Supreme Court, State Department. What were the immediate effects outlined in the sources?
Well, legal challenges, for one.
Mm.
Harvard University is mentioned. They were already in some kind of dispute, and this seemed to push them towards filing a lawsuit.
Hmm.
We can actually circle back to that Harvard thing specifically.
Okay. And for immigrant communities.
Increased fear, definitely. And accessing lawyers became harder, partly because of tactics, like those courthouse detentions.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're afraid to even go to the courthouse. How were these policies being talked about? What were the reactions?
Pretty sharply divided, as you'd expect. Critics raised alarms about humanitarian risks, mentioned vulnerable people like kids needing medical treatment.
And the other side.
Supporters argued these were necessary steps, national security, immigration control, that was the justification provided.
Okay, a clear split in perspective there. Now, staying with U.S. politics, the material also flags the president's use of pardons on this day.
Ah, yes, another significant executive action. Some pretty high-profile names mentioned.
Who are we talking about specifically?
The sources name a former Virginia sheriff, Scott Jenkins. He'd been convicted on corruption charges.
Okay, Scott Jenkins.
And also Todd and Julie Chrisley, the reality TV personalities. They were in prison for tax evasion and bank fraud.
The Chrisleys, right. So Jenkins and the Chrisleys. The background material suggests this fits a pattern, doesn't it? Using pardons for allies or controversial figures.
Yeah, that's the context provided.
Yeah.
Key people.
Yeah.
Trump, obviously, Jenkins, the Chrisleys. And interestingly, the notes mention Ed Martin, the new pardon attorney.
Right. What impact did these specific pardons have on May 28th, according to the material?
Well, it seems they immediately reignited the whole debate around presidential power. How far does it go? Is justice becoming politicized?
That seems to be the core tension highlighted, and the reactions followed that pattern.
Pretty much. Critics accusing Trump of undermining the rule of law. Supporters saying, no, he's actually correcting cases where prosecutors went too far.
Two very different interpretations of the same act. Okay, now you mentioned Harvard earlier, and there's a whole section here on a specific major dispute with the university. It went beyond just student visas.
Oh, yeah. It escalated significantly on this day. The administration actually ordered all federal agencies to terminate their contracts with Harvard.
All federal contracts, that sounds huge. What was the background there? What led up to that?
It was described as an escalating fight over several things: hiring, admissions policies, even how Harvard handled campus protests.
So multiple issues converging.
Right. And it followed earlier moves, like restricting international student enrollment that links back to the immigration point and demands for Harvard to get rid of diversity and inclusion programs.
Okay, so a broader clash. Players of the administration and Harvard. What were the potential impacts discussed?
Financially, it could cost Harvard over $100 million. That's the figure mentioned. And Harvard's response: they sued,
Sued the administration. On what grounds?
claiming violations of the First Amendment.
Wow. Over $100 million in a First Amendment lawsuit. How did others react, the wider academic community, for example?
Well, the sources say the academic community warned about a chilling effect, on higher education, on research, if universities could face this kind of action.
And the administration's view.
Officials argued it was about accountability, making sure universities followed federal policies.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of some major U.S. developments on that day. Let's shift focus now. International affairs and conflicts. There are some really serious headlines here too.
Absolutely. One area getting a lot of attention in the material is the Israel-Gaza conflict and also related strikes in Yemen.
Right. What specific events happened on May 28th?
The information indicates Israel carried out multiple airstrikes on Yemen's Hudaydah port. This was framed as retaliation for an attack on Ben Gurion Airport in Israel.
Okay, so a retaliatory strike, widening the conflict geographically, and what was happening in Gaza at the same time.
Tragically, yes. Israeli bombing in Gaza on that day killed at least 23 Palestinians. The material specifically notes children were among the victims.
That's just awful. And this is all happening against a backdrop of ongoing tension, isn't it?
It is. These strikes fit into that larger pattern of regional instability. The sources also mention Israel's security cabinet announcing plans to control indefinitely over 70% of Gaza.
70% indefinitely. Wow. So key players: Israeli military, Houthi forces in Yemen, Palestinian civilians caught in the middle. What were the impacts highlighted?
Heightened humanitarian concerns, obviously,
Yeah.
and just, well, more regional instability. Pretty clear outcomes from these actions.
And the international reaction.
The material points to significant international condemnation, especially regarding the civilian deaths in Gaza. Israeli officials, on the other hand, cited security needs as the reason for their actions in both places.
Another major flashpoint covered in the material is India-Pakistan. Looks like there was a serious military flare-up.
Yes, a major military operation launched by Pakistan against India included airstrikes, missile attacks. Pretty serious stuff.
A major escalation. Was there any attempt to stop it?
Well, the U.S. reportedly stepped in to mediate a ceasefire.
A U.S.-mediated ceasefire. Did it hold?
Not really, it seems. The material notes that reports of violations and new clashes started coming in almost immediately after it was supposed to start.
So very fragile ceasefire at best. This is all rooted in those long-standing issues, right? Disputed territories, military buildups.
Exactly. That's the context. Key figures mentioned in the mediation attempt include President Trump, Pakistani Deputy PM Ishaq Dar, and India's Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri.
And the impact of this flare-up.
Displacement of people, airspace closures causing travel chaos, and just, widespread fear of a bigger war breaking out between them. Nuclear powers, remember.
Incredibly high stakes, yes. And the reactions.
International calls for restraint, mainly. And after the ceasefire attempt kind of fizzled, both sides were reportedly blaming each other for the violations.
Sounds like a very tense situation. The material also mentions something briefly about Europe, France, and Poland.
Right. Just a note about them signing a mutual assistance treaty.
What's the significance of that?
Well, the background suggests it's tied to regional security worries and maybe shifting alliances in Europe. Key figures were Macron from France and Tusk from Poland.
And the impact.
Seen as boosting defense cooperation between them and maybe signaling more unity within the EU on security matters.
Okay. A move towards closer ties there. All right, let's pivot again. Science and technology, the material touches on some developments there too.
Yeah, a couple of significant items. One was from Microsoft.
Microsoft, what were they up to?
Announcing layoffs. Pretty abrupt ones, apparently, affecting 3% of their global workforce.
3% globally, that's a lot of people.
It is. And the reason given was productivity concerns. The background notes point out this fits into that broader trend of tech layoffs we've been seeing.
Right. It does seem like a pattern. What were the impacts noted?
Well, the job losses themselves, obviously,
Yeah.
but also adding to market uncertainty and more scrutiny on these big tech companies and their strategies.
Okay. And the other tech item? SpaceX.
Yep, the ninth test flight of Starship, the
Ah.
big reusable rocket system they're developing.
Yeah, yes, Starship. What was the goal for this flight?
Primarily testing things aimed at making it more reusable. That's the key goal for Starship.
And how did it go?
Uh, Kind of a mixed bag,
Really?
according to the sources. Progress in some ways, failures in others.
Okay, what was the progress?
It flew further than previous test flights, so, covering more distance.
Right. And the failures, specifically on reusability.
Yeah, that's where the problems were. It failed to deploy the satellites it was carrying, which is a big part of its future business model.
Didn't deploy the payload.
Okay. And crucially for reusability, it failed to reignite its engines properly during re-entry for the landing sequence.
Ah, so the landing burn didn't work. That's critical. Starship is central to their Mars plans and satellite launches, right?
Exactly. So this test flight kind of highlights both the progress they're making, but also the really significant technical hurdles they still need to clear to get that fully reusable system working.
Progress, but major challenges remain.
Got it. Shifting gears one more time, the material also covers some major weather and disaster events from May 28th. Yeah, a stark reminder of, well, environmental forces and maybe the impact of climate change.
What happened in the Alps? That sounds serious.
Extremely serious. A major glacier collapse. It reportedly buried a Swiss mountain village.
Buried a village. Devastating.
Yeah. Rescue operations were underway when this material was compiled. The background links this increased risk to melting glaciers, climate change making these slopes less stable,
And the impacts.
casualties, displacement, obviously, and renewed calls for more urgent climate action, according to the sources.
And it wasn't just the Alps, right? Major wildfires were also happening.
That's right. States of emergency declared because of severe wildfires in two different places.
Where were those?
Manitoba, in Canada, they declared a province-wide state of emergency.
Province-wide. That indicates the scale. And the other location.
Russia's Buryatia region, also a state of emergency there. Wildfires had burned over 53,000 hectares.
53,000 hectares. Just vast areas. And the context here is similar, right? Linked to climate change, worsening fire seasons.
Yes, both regions mentioned as facing increasingly severe wildfire seasons. The impacts noted: evacuations, property loss, and major health risks from all the smoke.
A really tough day for people in those areas. Okay, almost there. The material briefly mentions a couple of other global political points.
Yeah, just quick mentions, rounding things out.
Like Romania, there was an election.
First round of their presidential election, George Simeon was leading, but nobody got a majority, so it was heading for a runoff.
Okay, so more political uncertainty to come there. The background suggests it's seen as a test between populist and pro-European forces.
Right. Potential policy shifts depending on the runoff outcome. That's the main takeaway.
And Lebanon. What was happening there?
Municipal elections started in some parts of the country. This was highlighted because it's happening despite the ongoing national political paralysis Lebanon's been facing.
So local democracy moving forward, even with national gridlock, any potential impact.
Maybe some shifts in the local government, possibly putting a bit more pressure on for wider national reforms.
Okay, so if we step back and look at everything we've just gone through, U.S. policy, immigration, pardons, global conflicts in the Middle East and South Asia, tech layoffs and rocket tests, devastating natural disasters, elections in Europe and the Middle East, it's a really packed day.
It really is. And the material, as you mentioned, has that section on perspectives and reactions, trying to tie some of this together. It really emphasizes the contrasting viewpoints on nearly everything.
Yeah, like on immigration, the security frame versus the humanitarian frame.
Exactly. Or in the conflicts, calls for ceasefires hitting the wall of perceived security needs and accusations flying back and forth.
And the disasters, too. The immediate response versus the longer-term climate change discussion.
Right. Scientists pushing for climate action, while the immediate focus is understandably on rescue and relief. It's like these parallel tracks of conversation about the same events.
It really highlights how hard it is to find common ground or even agree on the problem sometimes. Looking back at this May 28th snapshot, what's the one thing that really stands out to you?
For me, I think it's just the sheer density and variety of major events happening all at once, all around the world. It really drives home how interconnected everything is. A policy in the U.S. sparks a lawsuit. A conflict over there has global ripples, tech advances, nature strikes back.
Yeah.
It all feels linked, even when the events seem separate. It's just the complexity of the world we live in, laid bare on a single day.
Definitely gives you a lot to think about from just one day's worth of headlines.
It really does.
So we've done our deep dive into the material you provided, touching on this huge range of topics from May 28th, 2025, Government, conflict, tech, environment.
A packed day, no doubt. But hopefully, a clearer picture emerges from pulling those threads together.
Right. So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with based on all this. Considering this single day, this snapshot, what does it tell us about the challenges we face? Are these forces, global competition, political divides at home, the drive for new tech, the environment changing? Are they just constants showing up in different ways?
That's a great question. It does feel like recurring themes, doesn't it?
And given those starkly different ways people reacted to almost everything we talked about, according to the sources, how does that complexity, those different viewpoints, affect our ability to actually tackle these shared problems? Something to mull over.
Definitely something to ponder.